Hello, welcome back to the studio. This week, a nice easy tree painting tutorial in oils. I start with a lovely reference photograph and a canvas, and I show you how to set out the scene, how to do a basic sketch, and then a three-step process to go from blank canvas to a finished painting. Plus there's some bonus footage, making canvases and cleaning brushes, because you asked me to show you how I do it. And of course, why I need a shoe. Want to know more about this? Well, watch all the way through to the end. Our reference picture today is this beautiful tree set in a landscape. And I've done a little bit of work on this to make it an easier sort of project for us to work on. For instance, I've actually toned down these background trees and made them a little paler and made this tree stand out a little bit more. So I've sort of brought this forward. I've also enhanced this little shadow. So this is going to be the reference, and I'll post a link to this on the page down in the description below, so you'll be able to go and get this from Pixabay. And the very first thing we want to do is we want to actually sketch this onto a canvas. And for this, I'm actually going to use a tested method that I've used before, which is actually sketch using oil paint. Now, let's have a quick look at the palette. Today, I'm using some different colours, not from the Bob Ross range necessarily, but some titanium white, some cerulean blue, which is a lovely soft duck egg blue colour, touch of Payne's grey, and some very dark brown. And the colour I'm going to start with is some Payne's grey. I've got a small round brush, pretty well worn actually, and what I want to do is actually want to thin this paint down with some odourless thinners. Now, I've put just the tiniest little drop in the bottom of this dish because you only literally need a speck. And I just want to take my brush, I just want to thin this down to make it into a wash. You see, it's quite runny. Not the easiest thing to demonstrate. Holding up in front of the camera, that'll be down my sleeve before I know where it is. But I want just a thin wash so that I can just draw and sketch with it. The advantage here is that you can actually sort of sketch straight onto your canvas. Now, before I go any further, this is a paper DIY canvas, and if you want to know how to make these, I've actually done a little bit of B-roll, which I'm going to sort of pop in later on in the video, so carry on watching until you see that little section. This is made of paper. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the reference photograph. I'll bring that up in the corner. And the very first thing we ever want to try and do when we're starting a practice sketch or any kind of a painting is to establish a few different lines. Now, the tree is pretty much centre, which is what we want for a tree study, but the other line we want to know is where is the horizon line. Now, a bit of a trick here because there's actually more than one horizon line. There's the obvious horizon line, which could be where the tree is sitting. There's also the horizon line where that group of trees are on the right. But then there's, over on the left, you see there's another horizon line. So they're in slightly different positions. I tend to go for the one that's furthest away, which is that one over on the left here. And if you try and measure this out, you'll see that, well, it's pretty close to the bottom, probably somewhere around about the quarter. So I'm going to just sketch this on here. Now, what happens if you make a mistake? You think, oh no, I've made a terrible blunder. Well, this is just a baby wipe. Cheap and cheerful. Don't get anything with any of those sorts of things to make your skin soft. We just want a cheap, cheerful wet wipe. That's all we need. And as you see, I can just rub things out, give that a moment to dry. We can have another go. Right, I think I wasn't too far off, so I'm going to just again drop in that line there. So that's my distant horizon line. Then it comes forward, and then there's sort of a little bit of a drop, and then it comes forward a little bit more. So those trees are actually, they're in slightly different places, and there's a sort of changeover behind where the tree is, and the tree a tiny bit left of centre. Okay, so our sketch is going pretty well. The next thing I'm going to get you to think about is the proportions of your sketch. If we look at the reference picture over in the corner there, you can see that this tree is much wider than it is tall. And I'd like to try and think of putting something, if you like to think about putting something almost in a box, an imaginary box, and trying to imagine how big the box needs to be to contain all of it, because I think sometimes when we start sketching we tend to sort of go outside the lines a little bit. So let's have a think about how tall is the box. Well, it's almost to the top of the canvas, so we'll put a little mark up there. How far over to the left is this box? Bearing in mind it's going to try and sit in this this canvas, which is kind of not too far from the edge here, is it? So let's put a little mark there, and not quite as far to the right on this side. So put a little mark there. There's a few things to think about when you're doing this. We'll consider that in just a moment. And then we want to think about how far down on the tree trunk it goes. Now I've deliberately put the tree trunk in here, and I've painted through the horizon line down onto its shadow. So there we go. So we know that this is going to come down pretty close. There's actually not much of that tree trunk showing, is there? Now then, so we come down here. I think probably about there. So that's that. If you had imagined this was in a box, okay, that would be the sort of size it would be. And for a box, I just use the edge of my canvas as the box. Trying to do this tree on, say, a much bigger canvas, then of course I would probably have drawn out a little box and actually sketch the box onto the canvas. And it doesn't matter if you do that, because you know you can rub it all out. We're going to be painting this with a little bit of pace today, because I think practice work needs to be fun and quick, not laboured. And so I want to just be able to drop this on here and have a bit of fun painting. Who was that? That was Poppycat. I'll have a bit of fun dropping this onto my canvas and not having to sit and labour it too hard. But I do want a good tree, because a tree practice is what this is all about. Now then, let's have another look for some more lines. Well, there's a really lovely line coming through there. It looks almost like a big triangle, doesn't it? So let's just drop in a couple of, oops, a bit more thinners on me paint. Let's just drop in, there's a couple of squiggly lines there. There's a chunk there. There's another chunk there. And then there's that chunk that sits out on the end there. Oh, I've gone back out over my line again, haven't I? Never mind. And again, I'm just loosely dropping this in. And then we come across, we come down, and again, think about the proportions inside this imaginary box. And we come out as a nice big chunk there. There we go. And it's a little lower this side. It definitely comes down through that background horizon, doesn't it? But not down to here. Okay, so we're going to drop that in through there, out through there like that. So here we go. We've got a pretty good sized tree. I've got a few nice little holes in it, that light coming through. And that took us, what, maybe 5 minutes to sort of just sketch this in. And really that's about what I'd expect you to spend on something like this as a practice, is a nice, loose, simple sketch, not overworking anything, just getting the proportions sitting right on the canvas. Because, you know, you don't have to sit here for an hour just trying to get this bit right, do we? We want to kind of get on with the little painting. Now, let's work on our background sky. And for that, I'm going to use a wet on wet technique like Bob would use. For my background sky, I'm going to use the wet on wet technique, made sort of famous by this chap, Bob Ross. And this is some Bob Ross liquid white oil paint. I'm going to use a very thin coat of this on my canvas, just a little bit for the background, because, well, the sky isn't much of a feature. I just want this to make a lovely pale background for the sky, but also for the trees, which I want to push back into the painting a little bit more. And I've got a little bit of the liquid white in a plastic pot here. Now, this is fresh out of the freezer. That's right, you heard me. I put a little sample of my liquid white into an airtight container with a nice sort of snap lid to it, and I pop this into a freezer. What happens is it just chills the paint. It doesn't actually freeze it. What happens is it just goes sort of stiff. The nice thing about freezers is they're a very, very dry environment. There's actually very little low moisture, and it's pretty airless as well. So you've got it in an airtight container in an airtight fridge. And that's good for paint, because if the air doesn't get to it, then it can't dry out. You can do this with liquid white, liquid clear, liquid black, and all the oil paints. In fact, anything with an oil base can be put into a freezer, and it just chills it down. Just don't forget to tell other people though. You don't want to be digging it out and sort of trying to put it on a piece of toast, do we? Now, I just want to put in a very, very small amount of this liquid white. As I say, we're just going to use it to blend our background sky. Now, I'm just going to come down to that horizon line. I'm not going to fuss too much with the foreground. We'll get to that in a bit. But I'm just going to drop in everything down to that point. Punch just a couple of little holes through here. There might be a little bit of colour in there. But I want you to note how little paint there is on my canvas. You can do a fingertip test. There we go. And as you see, there's just enough to make my fingerprint show up, but nothing more. If it was any more than that, then my canvas would be too wet. I think this is probably one of the challenges people face when they start painting, is they overload their canvas with a liquid white or a liquid clear, and then they try and paint on it, and it's like a bit like painting on a big wet jelly. There's a little bit of liquid white in my brush, and I don't want that getting into my canvas, so I'm going to dry clean this brush, and I'm going to carry on using this for the next stage. To dry my brush, I'm just going to use a piece of paper towel, give it a good pinch and a good squeeze, and squeeze out as much of the paint as you can. For my background sky, I'm going to use a little touch of cerulean blue. And as you can see, I've already had a go at this sky, but somebody forgot to press record. I keep on doing that, don't I? So a little bit of cerulean blue, just a little bit. And as you can see, I already started, I put a little bit of cerulean blue into there, but just the opening sort of touches of colour here. And the sky, as I was talking, it's not the real feature of this painting, is it? It's the tree. So I'm going to literally just scrub this in very, very loosely. And then the next thing I want to do is a really nice, quick and easy little background for my painting here, just those background trees. And I say some nice pale green colours. I've pushed those trees way back. So let's mix up a pale green colour next. As I say, I kept them very pale. As I say, I doctored this photograph a little bit and I actually sort of made them much paler. They actually looked much darker in the original photograph, almost to the point where you couldn't see the edge of the tree. And I just want to have a look and see how pale they really have to be to get that depth and distance. Now, temptation is to just mix white and green and yellow and try and paint these up. But what happens is that they become too bright. And we want things that are dull and distant. Things that are far away tend to be low in brightness. They tend to have very little in the way of colour to them. So we want them to be dull and lacking in colour. And that will get us some depth and distance. There's also sort of several layers here, some dark shadows in here too. And again, we'll drop those in as we go. But this is the little bunch of trees I want to work on way off back in the distance. Payne's grey, maybe even some blue. And then a touch of green. So what we end up here is sort of like a dull green colour. It lacks kind of, it's almost like a nothing colour, isn't it really? So if I had a little bit of, there we go, a tiny touch of cadmium yellow into it, that's actually still quite bright. But does it match our reference? Well, not far off, I think. If you're looking at those really distant trees back in there, I think that'll work. The only way we can really be sure is to actually try some on our painting. And I think we got some of these slightly bigger trees on this side. They're slightly taller, slightly darker. You see, I could have just charged into my tree there and you wouldn't have stopped me, would you? Oh no. You see, I really should do a little bit of this background foliage in here, this field first. It's a real quick little step, so I think I'll do that before I start the tree. I'm trying to think, does that look about right? Is that about right? Not bad. pretty close. Let's thin that down a little tiny bit more. And something else you'll often hear me tell you is that no one's going to see this painting hanging on the wall with the reference photograph unless you want them to. So you can get away with doing things a little more interesting. Into some very dark brown there, it won't matter too much. Let us drop in the suggestion of the shadow. Now, this is an important part of the painting. What does the shadow tell you about the position of the light? Okay, what does it tell you? A couple of the key things it should reveal. And I dare say one or two of you will be jumping up and down, telling me exactly what they should be. Well, what do you reckon? Well, the most obvious one is where the sun is in the sky. Got a lovely big tree, and really the shadow for the tree, maybe starts over here somewhere, but the vast majority of shadow is over here on the left, but doesn't extend too much further behind the tree. So it's not so much over to there, it's more sort of up there, I think. In fact, the vast majority of the shadow is being thrown on the ground. And the other thing it tells you is it over there but back, behind, or in front? And that is told or dictated by where that shadow falls. This shadow is falling, coming slightly forward, so it's coming down. And it's heading towards that corner almost, isn't it? That tells me that the shadow, the sun is probably slightly behind the tree, and it's actually sort of throwing the shadow forwards a little bit more. Mucking about with this for a few minutes, and when we come back, finally we can start painting our tree. So with a little help from Henny on the left, let's make a DIY canvas. This is just standard decorator's paper. It's a lining paper, and I use it to cover an old canvas. I lay the canvas face down, pin down the paper of course with my tape, then use the end of a blunt palette knife just to mark the paper. It sort of scores it in the right sort of position. Then just push up, crease it, and just use that same palette knife to split the sheet. It'll be exactly the right size. Don't forget, there's a smooth side and a rough side to lining paper, and we want the rough side outwards. Now line it up carefully on the corner, little piece of tape, just secure that corner and work your way around the paper. Make sure I put one in the middle of each of the sides. Once you get to the end and you've got this overhang, I use the handle of my knife just to sort of score that flap and just tuck it in, or you can trim it off. There we go. Little trim with the pair of scissors to get rid of that little overhang. Then I use the handle of my palette knife just to really make sure that that tape is well stuck. I then want to give this a couple of coats of light grey acrylic paint. This seals the surface. It means that the oil paint won't sink in. I apply a small amount and use a roller just to spread it out evenly. Once the first coat's dry, as I say, add a second coat and you're ready to go. By the way, I store the roller in a plastic bag. I just leave it in a drawer until I'm ready for the next one. So we're off to a flying start with our painting. But what comes next? You see, when you're sitting in front of your painting with your reference photograph, you have to sort of remember what sort of order things have to go in. It's no good putting in, say, some bright highlights first and then trying to get some dark in underneath it. Bob was always very good about this. He'd always underpaint his paintings with a nice dark green colour, which was thick and dry, and he put some highlights on top, which would stick nice and easily because they were thinner and oilier. And we could do the same thing with this tree, but I actually want to paint this more like a traditional sort of oil painting. I need a little bit of a shadow colour under there, and I do need a dark shadow. So I want dark tones and I want some mid-tones, and then I'll finish off with some highlights. That traditionally is the way most oil paintings are done. But what about a tree trunk and some branches first? Yeah, that seems like a sensible idea. So that's what I'll do next. So we have a quick look at our reference photograph up there. You can see we've got obviously the nice tree trunk under there, and you see a few branches sort of working their way up through the foliage here. Now it is always a bit of a juggling match, because you could paint the entire tree branches and everything and then cover some of it up and have to try and pull it back up over the top. So it's no sort of perfect sort of fit for any of this, but you do the best you can. Now I'm going to go into some Van Dyke brown for my tree trunk, because it is a nice dark sort of brown colour. I can go darker than that. I could pull some yellow ochre into it and go lighter than that. But Van Dyke brown, good starting point, I think. And again, I'm just going to drop in a nice tree trunk here. Reasonable amount of paint. I want this to be a little bit textured. If you've seen any of my paintings, you know that one of my little golden rules is if it feels like a tree trunk and it looks like a tree trunk, then you probably got the best tree trunk ever. Now I'm just going to drop in a little suggestion here again. Looking at my reference, I think there's a nice big branch going out through here, and as I suggested there, you know, some of this is going to get covered up and a little bit lost, but it's okay. And there's a nice big branch, I think, going out through here. Well, I think there is anyway, so there it is. And I get a little bit of colour onto here, and I think there's obviously going to be a nice tree trunk or two going up the centre. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you know, no one's going to see this hanging on a wall with the reference picture beside it. So we can be a little inventive when we do our trees. We don't have to be too much of a slave. And I'm painting this wet on dry. In other words, it's more like a traditional oil painting at this stage. And much as I love to paint wet on wet, when you're sort of trying to practice and you're trying to do it like something like a little tree study, it's kind of fun to actually try and paint it like the old masters would do it, you know, with actual going sort of straight onto a dry canvas, and just sort of work the paint in. Again, I'm looking around at the reference here. I'm trying to spot the odd branch, because there's a whole structure of stuff going on under here. So some of this will be a little darker, but there's a little something out there as well. And you can see how dry this paint is. It sort of breaks up on contact, and I'm okay with that as well. If I wanted to stick, I could sit my brush in there and give it a bit more of a rub, but I'm actually okay with it sort of breaking up a little bit. There we go. So maybe that's enough. I'll add more to this as it goes on, but before I go any much further into this, I want to start introducing some darker green tones into my painting. I think those shadow values next. So far you've seen me use a little round brush and a flat brush for doing all of my painting, so I could pretty much carry on with either of these two brushes, but sometimes it's nice to actually sort of introduce another couple of brushes, a filbert brush and a fan brush. Fans are particularly useful for doing these sort of nice broken edges and putting in those nice little broken bits of colour. And a filbert's a little bit sort of tighter and flatter, and it's great for pushing in those dark values. So I'm going to use a filbert brush next. And the darkest colours I think are probably right buried in the back of my painting in here. Remember, the light is coming from the other side of this tree. Remember, the shadow is being cast slightly forward, so we know it's slightly bit to the back of this tree. So we really got two main colours here, a deep shadow and a highlight with a few mid-tones. So I want a nice deep dark green colour, and I'm going to use some sap green and some Payne's grey. Now, the question that might come up is, why didn't I just use black? Get me a pan out where you can see it. Why didn't I just use black and sap green? And I could use black and sap green, but from choice, I kind of like what Payne's grey does for my paintings. It's not such a dead colour. Black tends to flatten everything completely. Payne's grey is a more subtle darkening of colours, and I like Payne's grey a lot. I wish Bob had used it maybe in his own paintings. But it's something I urge you to try and use, because you can get some really lovely subtle shifts of colour. And you can add more Payne's grey to the point where it almost becomes black. Like that, but not quite ever black. So I'm looking at my painting here, I'm looking for some shapes Now, here's a little trick I showed you on the last painting I did where we did a waterfall. If you're struggling to see shapes, in other words, if you look at your reference paint and all you see is a tree, and I say find me some dark shapes and you can't see them very easily, if you turn your picture upside down, so you're not really looking at a tree, you're looking at something more abstract, you can see there's a big chunk of dark here, a nice big chunk of dark there, big chunks of dark all over, but predominantly here, here, and a little bit in here. So by flipping it upside down, you instantly can sort of zero in on that sort of a shape. Can you see what that looks like? Kind of looks like a fir tree laying on its side, doesn't it? So there's that shape. Yeah. So we can sort of imagine where it is. Now, look at how far up the tree it is. How far is that up? Is it halfway? Not far off, is it? About halfway up. And again, I'm just going to stipple on a little bit of colour just for position. And I've got this lovely dark piece hanging down here. And that's what, not quite halfway. There's the tree trunk and there's the edge of the tree. So that's not quite halfway out to the edge, is it? So we can sort of measure that tree trunk to the edge. And I'm going to put a little mark just there to remind me where it actually comes down to. And again, I'm just doing all of these little touches, sketching out in my mind's eye where things are going to go. There's a lovely piece of branch sitting just there, isn't there? So again, you put little marks on your painting, you look at your reference frequently, and you put small markers in, kind of telling you where to go. And this is the way to practice a painting rather than just going at it and hoping for the best. That is sort of really kind of more hit and hope, whereas what I'm doing here is I'm being quite intentional with the way I paint things. In other words, I'm not just hitting and hoping. I'm actually painting with, and I'm looking at my reference. I'm trying to get something which I think will work. Again, just what I tend to do, and again, it's another little trick when you're practicing, is when you're doing something and you're painting away, try and keep your brush close to, or if not in contact, whilst you look at your reference. So that way you don't take your hand away and then look away and then look back and then start in the wrong place. Again, it's a little trick that someone taught me many years ago that stuck with me, and it served me well, that I keep my brush in very close contact with my painting. And that sort of shape is starting to look about right. The angle's a bit steep. I'll level that up a bit, and I can always drop a little bit of a shadow down just to the side of it. There's a little bit dark just there too. Got some light coming through in here, and just over on the other side there. So just kind of just to the right of that tree trunk there is another little piece of dark there. So we're off to a good start. Once you have a few pieces of dark on here and you compare them to your reference photograph, you start getting a feel for the mapping out process. So that's what I'm going to do next. A little bit of time lapse, and you'll see me going backwards and forwards, putting in some of the darkest darks. So in that last sequence, if you look at the reference photograph, you see I've started working around putting in all these extra dark areas, going back and making some little changes. And I started the next process, which is to adding a mid-tone. In other words, I'm laying off the Payne's grey. I'm going to go for more of a sort of just a sort of a touch of Payne's grey and more sap green. I've run out of paint, of course. And so I've got the darkest darks, and now I've got the next tones up, and they're not easy to see, not easy to spot in this reference photograph, because as I say, the light's coming from the back instead of coming from the front. We'd have more sort of variation of tones. But all I'm doing here is I'm using a little bit less Payne's grey, But I want to still put in some shadow colour here, and we'll overpaint this with some highlight. But the shadow colour we're looking for, it's not completely dark, but we do need a fair bit of it. So at this stage, what we're doing is we're actually starting to sort of fill out the tree. We're starting to sort of work on individual branches. Now, here's a little section. There are two little branches here, which are really lovely, and they tuck in sort of to the edge of that little piece of shadow. And I'm going to just dab them in. And here's a neat little trick. It's very easy for you to lose positions on things. In other words, it all just ends up mushed together. So when you're painting, think about leaving some, what I call little relief lines. In other words, don't paint right up to the next shape. In other words, there's a lovely dark shape there, and I'm going to leave a tiniest little suggestion of light through there. This may not be quite the right position. I don't really care, to be honest. But I'm going to sort of dab this in. This is kind of like a mid-tone colour. And I try and leave that little tiny light around the edge so that it doesn't kind of get buried too much. And there's, let's say, this is just a little trick or a little tip I picked up from somewhere along the way about these little relief lines so that you don't lose chunks of your painting. And so I'm picking up a little brown as I go. It's all right, I'll just work that into my paint. So there you go, I did those two little branches there. I mapped them out and positioned them. And I'm going to go around my painting now, adding more and more of these little branches and adding more to the edges of my painting. And say it's a nice process to do, and it's something you should kind of get used to doing, these sorts of mappings out. And as I say, I don't want to take a tremendous amount of time over this, but I do want to do a nice job on it. So spend a few minutes just going around now, sort of getting these edges looking about right. Okay. Bit more time lapse, I think. So my little tree painting's coming along, and you see my tree filled out rather nicely. But I want to draw your attention to something which is absolutely crucial when you're painting. It's that dark colours aren't dark because you put lots of paint on there. They're dark because that's the colour you mixed up. Painting on a grey canvas greatly assists this because you're not trying to fight over something which is glaringly bright underneath it. But because you've mixed up a dark colour, you can still apply it thinly. If I touch my darkest greens, they are just still tacky. They've only been on there a couple of hours, but already I can start to feel them becoming stickier because they've been applied thinly, and yet you can't see the canvas through them. So, bearing that in mind, you don't have to pile on a lot of dark green paint to make it, well, dark. It's already dark. Similarly, with the midtones, again, just been done, and yet they're still just sticky. It means the next stage, which is highlights, will stick nice and easily. There's a little bit of texture, but it's not sort of thick with heavy paint. And that is a crucial thing to remember when you're doing your next paintings. Don't pile tons of paint onto your canvas. You just hamper yourself for the next stages. Now, speaking of canvases, here's a little bit of B-roll of me making one of my DIY canvases. Might save you a few pennies. Later on, we'll do some brush cleaning. I've got a bit of B-roll for that too, so stay tuned. But highlights, what should we do it with? I don't know. A fan brush? Seems like a good choice to me. Let's give that a try. Okay, I'll bring the reference up in the corner. I'm going to paint the highlights on top of the mid-tones. The darks, well, they stay dark. That's the whole sort of thing for them. They're dark and they stay dark. And the mid-tones, they are the sort of the underpainting for the highlights. Without the underpainting on there, well, you'd be trying to paint sort of a nice bright green colour, maybe on top of a pale grey colour, and well, they just wouldn't show up. Now, by habit, the Bob Ross paints are already sort of nice and oily when it comes to highlights. And you can see that my sap green colour there is a little bit firm, and my cad yellow, well, it's a little bit on the oily side. It may or may not stick. Let's do a quick colour check here, make sure I'm in the right sort of zone area. So let's pick a little bit of my tree, and I'm going to just use the corner of my fan brush here to just stipple on a little bit of colour. So here's my fan brush, and it's pretty well loaded with paint, but it's just sitting out on the edges of the bristles. You see them sitting out there on the tips. See, the idea is we don't actually want to just bury this with colour. We want to apply a few nice little touches of highlight. Every touch is like a little bunch of leaves. So we're applying this very sort of small strokes here, leaving some of the underpainting coming through. And that's the sort of important thing here. We don't want to just cover this up with this next new colour. It's going to be a little brighter on the edge and getting darker. So brighter here and getting darker here. So I've got a freshly loaded brush, and I'll touch the very edge of my tree. And as my paint runs out, I'll do a little bit of shadow there. So I've just done two little bits of my tree. Now, this is a very gentle process. It's not something you want to rush at, but you can take your time with it, and you can do a little and step back, do a little more and step back. There we go. So very quickly I'm going to have this little section done, and it's a case of doing some, standing back, coming back and then doing a little bit more. And very quickly you're going to have yourself a lovely tree. Cover up those lines a little bit. There we go. And by doing this in 3 separate stages, you develop a really beautiful looking tree that would sort of stand scrutiny by anybody, I think. Now, this is very different to the way Bob painted his trees. Bob would cover everything with a very nice dark undercolour. He would use the corner of his brush to come back in and complete the painting. Bob was painting at speed, and we are not. We are painting at leisure. And that's the other important thing to remember. Different techniques give you different effects for different circumstances. Maybe I should try painting this tree like Bob would paint it. See what the differences look like. That might be fun to do. As you see, just quickly going along here. Keep using your reference picture because there's a lovely patch of shadow in here that I don't want to get rid of. And I'll just keep adding little touches of highlights. Join me for the next little bit, which is going to be a bit of time lapse, of course. Now, something to keep in mind. Just because we're doing highlights doesn't mean to say you can't darken up your dark green sometimes. Put a little bit of Van Dyke Brown into it. I've added a tiniest drop of oil because my green was drying out. It started to become too thick to paint with. So you can actually pick up some dark green and go back in here and add in a little bit of shadow as well. So it's not all about adding highlights. You can add little touches of shadow as well. There. Look at that. Let's carry on adding more highlights and a few more shadows too. For my brush cleaning, I have this pot with a lid and I have a rack suspended on some wires. It's actually an old coat hanger. It means that my brush cleaning rack doesn't sit down, well, in all the paint at the bottom of the pot. I also line my plastic pot with a Ziploc bag. It really helps with that cleanup. Now, when it comes to washing your brushes, just work it around on the rack and all the heavy paint sinks to the bottom. Don't forget to dry clean that brush before you do this, or else, well, your thinners gets really contaminated very quickly. For my bigger brushes, I use this. It's a beater rack. I use these with a 1-inch or a 2-inch brush. I put it down in the bottom of a nice long bin, something like a kitchen waste bin. Once you've beaten the thinners off it, you can dry it and they're ready to go. And by the way, what do I use the shoe for? Well, if you hadn't guessed, it's to store my brushes once I've dried them. There you go, big ones and small ones. They all live together until they're dry. Now, as my painting comes together, I like to throw in a little variation of colour. So I'm using sap green, cad yellow, and just a little yellow ochre sometimes as well, just for a little bit of fun. Again, this is just artistic impression. As I say, I'm not going to have this hanging on the wall next to my original painting. So just here you can see I started introducing a little bit of yellow ochre. Again, just for variety's sake, because the highlighting on this tree tends to be a little bit very flat in some respects. Quite a tricky tree to paint. So there we go, putting a little bit of yellow ochre into it. Just give my painting a little bit of pop. Yeah, look at that. Wow. It's a small thing, isn't it? But well, you know what they say, little things please little minds. The other thing I'm going to get you to kind of look at is to make sure you're not painting what I call islands. In other words, an island of colour, an island of colour. And so they're all kind of dotted around. That's sort of the equivalent of painting a sort of a thumbprint tree, which I know we sometimes do sometimes. We sort of paint, you know, in blobs. Look at the reference picture again and notice how one piece of the tree might just link up to the other piece of a tree. So you've got kind of joining and interconnecting pieces and little pieces of dark in between. So it's fun to just paint individual bits of tree, but make sure they do sit together on the painting properly. I'll save that little piece there, add a bit of shadow into here. And now I've sort of got a natural sort of link between branches. So again, this is just one of those things you learn as you're going along. Now the other thing is, you might notice my fan brush. It has two corners. I have a dark one and I have a light one. So I use one corner of my fan brush to pick up highlights and the other corner I use for picking up the darks. There you go. So you get two fan brushes out of one when you're adding your little highlights and shadows. You don't have to keep having two brushes in your hand, just use different corners. You can put a little bit of white with it to make a slightly pale brown colour, a little bit of ochre. And so a little bit of light getting through there. It just goes to show that the light was just able to sneak around that corner, wasn't it? So, and again, this tree trunk is just tacky now, so it'll take a little bit of light. I'm using just a small round brush for this. Don't make it too white. It'll look a bit strange otherwise. It's going to come back in and just really darken this up a little bit. So just add a little bit more sort of weight to it. Now, neat little trick here. Once you've actually dabbed this on, I'm not laying the brush flat. I'm stippling it on here in sort of quite little bits and blobs. I don't want it to be sort of like a hard line. As you get to the end of this shadow the tree's casting, so it's going to get a little bit thinner because the tree's a little bit sort of thinner at the edges than it is in the centre. So let the paint run out a little bit more. And here's a neat little trick. Get your, and this works with a really nice old crunchy brush here. Take your brush and just do a few little upward pushes with the bristles here. It's a bit harsh on the old brush, but if you can just do a few little presses, a few little flicks, it's a tiny little touch, but you can create little grasses under there. Just a little push. You can do the same with the light colours too. You can push up, and in fact I've done a little bit of that as well. So you can push up with layers of grass here, and you can create, again, a little touch of detail. It's just a little bit of fun, isn't it, that you can just add very quickly to a painting. Just a few little upward pushes. There we go. And I say, I think that a few of these little trees over here in the background may be just a little hair darker, so let's get back in here and just add in a little bit of this darker green colour. Don't want to go too mad with it, of course. Just want to add a little bit of something in there. Again, just to give the balance between near and far. Things that are nearer tend to be darker in colour, and a little tiny bit more detail. And things that are far away, pale, and tending to be more blue-grey. So quite pastel blue-grey colours. And there we go. I'll do one more stand back and see if I like the shapes of these. Maybe they're a little bit sort of harsh, and I might come in and just sort of soften these edges up overall. But I think I'm pretty much done. So there you have it, my finished painting. A realistic tree painted in oil step by step. And this is a practice tutorial I think everybody should try. No matter what sort of tree, the techniques will still apply. Now don't move, there's some more lovely tutorials for you to watch coming right along. Ooh, and don't forget, if you like what I've done, give it a little thumbs up. You can subscribe to the channel, you can even drop a drink in my coffee cup. It all goes to paying for, well, more materials. Now, on to the next paintings. Happy painting, people.